Last time we looked at Lynn Rudder Baker's argument for the moral permissibility of abortion based on her claim that the human person doesn't begin to exist until around birth, which is based on her theory about what a human person is, as something that has a rudimentary first-person perspective, which is constituted by a human organism. For this lecture, what I want to do is take a step back and look at the bigger picture about the major debates about when the human person, when we begin to exist. So for this lecture, what you'll need is you'll need a chart that I made available on Canvas, which looks a bit like this, which is about when we begin to exist. What it does is it lists off all the different options which are held by different views of the human person. And it goes into detail about where different views fall. And it also goes into some debates about why you'd think one of the answers rather than the other is the right answer. So as we go through the chart, right, we'll see that there are a couple different options. The question, when did we begin to exist? When did you begin to exist? The first view that I have here, so on the left, it goes earlier and earlier, and on the right goes later and later. The earliest option I can see is that you began to exist before the conception of the human organism. On some views of reincarnation, according to which your soul pre-existed your body and you just are wherever that soul is. We get something like this argument in Plato's Phaedo that we read. You'll get it also in some Eastern religions, the idea that you existed long before the human organism that you're related to was conceived. So what view can hold that one? Only a really sort of strong, pure substance dualist view. But the second earliest answer for when you begin to exist is at conception. The second option is day 14 or day 16 after conception. The third option is sometime later in utero. The next option is maybe at birth. The next option is maybe sometime in infancy. And then I want to lump together other views that would say even later than infancy is when you began to exist. Now notice that whenever you say that we begin to exist, it means that you didn't exist any earlier than that. So if you say that you didn't come to exist until sometimes in infancy, and that means, right, whatever was there before, right, whatever it was that was born, whatever it was that was in your mother's womb was not you. It was something else that gave rise to you at a certain point in time. So as we look through the various options for when we begin to exist, the first way to categorize them is roughly between the answers that are going to be the ones that the biological approach is going to give and the answers that the psychological approach is going to give. So as the psychological approach approaches this question, when did we begin to exist? The question is, when are the sorts of psychological capacities that are key to your identity, when did those first come on the scene? And so you might think that all you need for the psychological being that you are is the development of something like a higher brain. The thinking part view, for example, might say that you begin to exist whenever there is some portion of the brain that is capable of supporting something like consciousness is on the scene. And so we might think that this happens sometime in utero. Now, Lynn Rudder Baker thinks that the moment at which the relevant psychological capacities are on the scene is at or around birth. And so that's why she thinks that you begin to exist there, is because you don't have a rudimentary first-person perspective until around to that point. And that, she thinks, is the key to when the human person is on the scene. In an earlier work, she actually thought that you didn't begin to exist, the human person didn't begin to exist until it established a robust first-person perspective, which doesn't happen until sometime in infancy, maybe even later, right? Not until it develops the capacity to use the first-person pronoun. And the last one, you might think that you didn't begin to exist until actually way later. Now, what view would say that? Well, on the Locke view, remember, you only exist as far back as you can remember. So if you can only remember to last week is when you began to exist. So on Locke's view, it could be like relatively recent that you began to exist. On the earlier Baker view, it would have been sometime in infancy. In the later Baker view, it's sometime around birth. On the McMahon view, it might be sometime in utero. Now, once again, what they're trying to establish here is when the psychological capacities or states that they think are necessary for the continuity of the person are first present. And so different psychological approaches are going to have different answers to when you begin, depending on which particular capacities or states they think is essential to your identity. Is it memory? Is it capacity for robust first-person perspective language use? Is it just more basic first-person perspective? Is it just some functioning piece of the hardware that can support various psychological capacities? Notice how they're going to answer this question depends on what sort of specific view they have of what the human person is and what makes you the same over time. So those views are all going to be discussions within the psychological camp about when we should say that the human person begins to exist. You can see that actually there's a pretty long span there. It could make a big difference on some of these applied ethical issues. If right, you begin to exist sometime in utero, it might follow, right, that any time in utero after that point, abortion would be off limits. Whereas on Lynn Rudder Baker's view, because you don't exist until around birth, that means that anything before that would be ending the life of something that isn't you. If you have a view that you don't come into existence until infancy, it might even make permissible, in certain cases, infanticide. That it wouldn't end the life of something that is the same sort of thing as you very early on, maybe even after birth. So you can see how it can have some pretty big repercussions. Now, how do you determine which is the right answer on the psychological approach? Well, you have to go back and look to see which is the most plausible version of that view about what makes us the same over time. That will help you determine which is the right answer for when you began to exist. Now, if you look at the answers on the left side of the chart, these are the answers that the biological approach can give. The way that the biological approach approaches this question of when we begin to exist is by asking the question, well, when is there a human animal there? When is there a human organism there? When does the life begin of the human organism such that the life that's still here is continuous with the one that occurred way back there? And the two main answers that animalists or biological continuity theorists give is at conception or at day 14, 16. Now, isn't this just solely an empirical question, right? Can't the biologists, can't the embryologists, can't they just tell us when the human organism begins to exist? I think that the empirical data has a lot to say about when the human organism is present, but I don't think it settles it altogether. There's still various philosophical issues about, well, when can we say that something has a life? How complicated do the activities there need to be before we have something like a life? How much unity does there have to be among the parts before we get one single thing rather than just a loose connection of parts? These are the questions that are really settling the issue or helping us to determine whether the animalist, whether the biological approach should say we begin to exist at conception or day 14, 16. The real question, once again, on the animalist approach is whether the human organism begins to exist at conception, whether there's a human organism there, and whether it's the same human organism that's still here today, whether the human organism that you are doesn't come into existence until day 14 or day 16. So what's this debate all about? What are some of the crucial issues that are introduced to try to figure out whether the human animal begins at conception or at day 14, 16? I want to talk about these. I want to talk about them in some detail because I think some of them are really interesting. But also keep in mind, I haven't spelled this out completely on the chart. We have three main approaches to the human person. I've talked about how the psychological approach would consider this issue and the different answers they could give depending on which version of the psychological approach you hold. I've also talked about animalism and the major debate among animalists about whether the human animal begins to exist at conception or sometime shortly after. But there's also a debate to be had about what soul theorists should say about this. Now, we have two versions of soul theory, substance dualism and homomorphism, and so we can ask, when is the person present on each one of these versions of soul theory? Now, because the soul is a necessary condition for your existence and your continued existence, the question becomes, when is the soul present? So that'll tell us when the human person is present. Patrick Toner thinks that hylomorphists should say that whenever we have the human organism present, then we should think that the soul is present, because having a rational soul is just what makes something a human organism. And so Toner thinks that hylomorphic animalists, hylomorphists, should just piggyback on the debate that animalists are having, and however they settle the issue, that's what the hylomorphists should say. Substance dualists, on the other hand, don't see an important role for the soul to play with respect to the more basic biological functions. That's not the reason why they introduced the soul. They've introduced the idea of the soul to explain its more conscious activities, those of the higher, more rational or conscious variety. And so the substance dualists might say that the human person doesn't begin to exist until some of these conscious capacities capacities for a certain kind of consciousness are there, or until that consciousness is first on the scene. So the substance dualists then might side more with one or more of the psychological approaches about when the human person begins to exist. Or the hylomorphist, as a version of soul theorist, might go more with what the animalist says about when the human person begins to exist. Could a substance dualist say that the soul is there present at conception? They could say that, but notice that it's going to be hard to motivate that, because on substance dualism, all the soul is meant to explain is the psychological stuff. And so if there isn't any psychological stuff there, it's not clear what would push you into thinking that the soul is there from the start. Whereas in hylomorphism, because the soul is doing more, because it's also responsible for the more basic nutritive, vegetative, and sentient capacities, right, then there's better reason to think that the hylomorphic soul is present earlier on. Okay, so that's the way that generally psychological approaches will consider this question, how biological approaches in general will consider this question, and how soul theorists in general will consider this question. Notice how you answer this question, when do we begin to exist, depends crucially on what you think we are. If you the distinction between how the psychological approach answers this and how the biological approach answers this are very different. It can mean a matter of years in difference over when you began to exist. And there might be all sorts of ethical repercussions about this, the ones I spelled out last time. Maybe it has repercussions for abortion, because if it isn't you, why is it wrong to kill it? It might have repercussions for embryonic stem cell research, or certain forms of contraception, or in vitro fertilization, or embryo adoption, right? So a lot of this stuff is going to be packed into the question, I think, of when we begin to exist, because you can establish that it is the same sort of thing as us. That goes at least some way towards saying that, okay, well, then you shouldn't harm that thing. Whereas if you can establish that it isn't the same sort of thing as us, it's going to be harder to argue that you shouldn't harm it. It has the same sort of protections based on its same moral value as what we are. Okay, so that's a little bit overview of the debate then going through the chart. But now I want to focus a little more detail on this dispute among animalists on whether the human animal is there, present at conception, or more like day 14 to 16. Now, why should an animalist think that it's not there from conception? If the animal isn't there at conception, right, what is there? Well, here are some of the most common concerns for thinking that the human animal is there at conception. And we see these both in the Lynn Rutter Baker article, a part that I didn't go over, and principally we see this in the section of the Olson text that I had you read. Here are three major reasons that are given for thinking that the animal isn't there until day 14 or 16. Until, well, what happens at day 14, 16? Well, we've got implantation, and we've got some important other developments. We've got more job specialization among the parts. We've got something like a central control center in their presence. So we might think that, there we go. Now we have a singular organism. But why think that the organism isn't present until that point? I can see three reasons that are often given. The first has to do with a phenomenon known as monozygotic twinning. The second has to do with the phenomenon of totipotency, and the third has to do with the apparent lack of coordination or lack of unitive ends among the parts. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about monozygotic twinning, but here's the general idea, is that in any case of identical twins, the twins, in a way, come from a single zygote. The zygote, in a way, splits so as to produce two embryos. Right? This is how it happens with identical twins. With fraternal twins, it's a different sort of process. But with identical twins, and every time what happens is that we have a single fertilized zygote, which later splits into two separate developing embryos. And if everything goes well, right, it'll develop into two separate human organisms who look a lot alike. Now, there's a puzzle related to monozygotic twinning that has pushed some authors to think that, oh, because of this puzzle, we really shouldn't say that the human organism is there until twinning is no longer possible. And by day 1416, twinning is no longer possible. All the twinning has to take place before that point. There's something about the developmental trajectory or something like that. There's something about the stage of the development such that at day 1416, twinning is no longer possible. There's something that is set in stone such that we're just going to get one human organism here. Whereas prior to that, it's still open about whether twinning will in fact occur. And in fact, to my knowledge, we still don't exactly know why twinning occurs. We don't know whether it's sort of programmed from the inside or whether it's environmentally induced. But we do know that around day 1416, no matter what else happens, right, it looks like it's all set up. It's locked in, just going to be one human organism. But prior to that, it still could go a couple different ways. And some people think that's reason to think the human organism isn't there. I want to focus on this problem a little more in a little bit, but that's the general worry. What about the worry of totipotency? So the idea is that before day 1416, all the cells that compose the embryo are totipotent. What does it mean for them to be totipotent? It means that they could all become individual human organisms. Right? So the idea is that each of the cells in the very early embryo aren't specified. Right? They are all sort of general enough that they all could be, if they were removed from the whole, developed, given the right environmental conditions, into a separate human organism. So rather than it just being a matter of twinning, this is a matter of potentially a whole bunch of organisms coming from this one single embryo, because none of the cells are specialized yet. They each are just performing general tasks such that if removed from the whole, they could, given the right environmental conditions, develop into their own organism. So some people think that because the cells still have totipotency prior to day 1416, we don't have a singular human organism. What we have is a loose collection of several potential human organisms. And the third concern has to do with the lack of coordination or the lack of unitive end. The general idea is that early on in embryonic development, what we have are various parts which are, in a way, kind of working together, but only because the mother's body is sort of orchestrating this, forcing them to work together so as to develop into a human organism. So the idea is because they're not working on their own, because they're not coordinating without the help of the mother, that's an indication that we don't have enough unity there for it to be one singular organism. What we have are the pieces being put together so as to later produce an organism. These are the three major concerns for saying that the human animal begins to exist at conception. This is really heavy on the empirical side of things in order to figure out whether these are actual phenomenon and whether they really do show what the people who are arguing based on these things, whether they really do show that the human organism can't be there until day 1416. Depends a lot on doing some really careful empirical research on these matters. But I want to spend some time talking about the monozygotic twinning argument. One, because it's so prevalent, and two, because I think it's really interesting, and three, because I think it's related to a similar puzzle that we've already seen about the human person. So if you look in the back of this handout, I've got the rundown for how we should explore the phenomenon of monozygotic twinning. And I'm going to run through that and tell you how that goes. So monozygotic twinning, I said, is a case when all identical twins, develop from a single zygote. At a certain point before day 1416, I think it's maybe even before day 10, the zygote or the early embryo splits into two, and then when we have out of that develop two separate organisms. Now, how exactly to explain what goes on there and why might this be a problem for thinking that the human organism began to exist prior to that? Here's where I want to explain how monozygotic twinning is a kind of case of biological fission. Now, remember various fission cases that we've talked about in this course already. Principally, we talked about them in the Parfit case. What he talked about is either the branch line case of teletransportation, or he talked about the double transplant case of cerebrum transplantation. What we had in both cases is that we have two offshoots from a single human person. We have two offshoots, both of which preserve the relevant features of the human person. Both seem to have candidacy for being the original human person. But the puzzle about fission is they can't both be the same human person because they're different from one another. And because they're going to have various features and they're not going to have the right sort of unity or continuity between each other to actually constitute one single person. So fission cases are tricky, we saw them that it might even present sort of a fatal sort of dilemma to the psychological approach when we focus on these branch line and double transplant cases. What's interesting is that monozygotic twinning is a kind of biological fission. Richard Swinburne wanted to say that you could have a kind of biological fission if you split the brainstem in two and put it into two separate bodies along with the cerebrum. And whether or not that could actually work, here's a case of actual biological fission that happens at the early stages of the development of the human organism, monozygotic twinning. And it's not that rare. Any identical twins you know, right, came about as a result of this process of monozygotic twinning. So let's explore it as a kind of case of biological fission, and let's see what our options are for explaining what happens in such a case. So because it's a case of fission, what we have is an initial zygote or embryo, which we can call A, which splits or fissions into two offshoots. What we have is B and C. So now with a typical fission case, then the question becomes, well, what happened to A when this fission took place? And it looks like we've got at least 4 options, maybe 5 options. The first option for what happens is that A is B. A is one of the offshoots. It is the very same organism in B that was once A. Or the second option is to say that A is the other offshoot and not the first one. So C is A, or A is C. The organism that is C is the same organism that A was. Now, on both of these options, what you'd have to say is that B or C, the one that's not the original organism, is something new that came into existence with or as a result of the fission. So what's curious about these two options actually is that if we go with either 1 or 2, it'll really mean that only one of the twins began to exist at conception. It'll mean that at least one human person didn't begin to exist at conception, but began to exist at least a few days later. It means that, strictly speaking, one of the twins will be older than the other, which might be a curious thing to say, but I don't think it's a deal breaker. So the first 2 options is that A is B or A is C. The third option is to say that A is both B and C. But that doesn't look like a promising option because B and C clearly look like different biological organisms. To accept that view, you'd have to say that any identical twins you know are really the same person, are really the same organism. So that can't work. The fourth view is to say that A is neither B nor C. That when monozygotic twinning happens, the original thing that was there, A, the original zygote, which might be an organism of a certain sort, and indeed might even be a human organism of a sort, has ceased to exist. And that the result is that there are 2 brand new human organisms, B and C. That's the fourth option. Now the fifth option, actually, which is a sort of secret option, is to say that, right, A actually ambiguously refers to 2 things. The fifth proposal is that B and C were there all along. So it's not that A is just one of the offshoots, that A is just the other offshoot. It's not that A is both of the offshoots. It's not that A is no more. It's that A, right, there actually is no one A, but there's actually B and C there from the beginning. And so what we have in monozygotic twinning is just those 2 things that are both already there, just fully splitting. There were 2 there right from the start. So let's explore which of those options we can actually accept. Standard animalism, right, so the kind that Olson proposes, doesn't seem like it can say option 1 or option 2. Why? Because both B and C are biologically continuous with A. If there is a life in A, then it looks like that it is, in some sense, continued in both B and C. So the worry here is, like we had for the psychological approach, is that there's no fact in the world, according to standard animalism, that could make one rather than the other the original. And so it looks like both options 1 and 2 are off limits for the animalist. Can't accept both of those because there's no fact in the world that could make one of them rather than the other the original animal. Well, what about the third view, that it's both? I think for the reasons that I just gave, animalists can't accept the third option either, that A is both of them, because B and C are not the same organism, so A can't be both of them. And so if A can't be either of them, and it can't be both of them, then it seems like the option that they have to give is that A has ceased to exist. Or it could be the other way around, that there is no such thing as A, and that B and C are the first things we have on the scene. But let's focus on the idea that is option 4, that A ceases to exist when B and C arise. It looks like the animalist has to accept that option. It looks like they can't accept 1 or 2 because there's no fact in the world that would make one rather than the other the organism. They can't accept 3 because B and C are not actually the same organism. And it doesn't look like they can accept 5 because if we have any human organism in A, it's just one. It's just one comprehensive singular life. And so it can't be 5. And so it looks like the standard animalist has to accept that 4, that A is no more. This is perhaps problematic because, wait a second, we've got the continuity of life processes in both cases. In both B and C, the continuity of life processes is preserved. As Parfit put it for the psychological approach, how can a double success be a failure? How can the continuity of A's life in both B and C mean that A ceases to exist? A dies, and yet there, right, its life is continued. You might think that even though they're forced into 4, there aren't a whole lot of great options there for the animalist. And this is why some animalists think that what they ought to go for is that there isn't actually any human organism there at the start. Because 4 doesn't seem like a promising option either, and that seems to be the only one that they can take. It looks like you should avoid this whole worry by saying that there is no organism there at the first place. There is no A. And this is the monozygotic fission push into thinking that the human organism isn't there until after twinning is no longer possible. Now, what I think is that the hylomorphic animalist actually has a few more options here that are unavailable to the standard animalist. Notice and remember that hylomorphism is a version of a further fact theory. It is a version of soul theory. And so it has more to the human person beyond just the continuity of the metabolic functions and the metabolic processes. There's more to your identity over time than just biological continuity. There is also the continuity of your soul. And so I think hylomorphists could say option 4, that what happens in monozygotic twinning is the original organism has ceased to exist, and B and C are 2 brand new organisms. They could go that way, as standard animalists seem to be forced into. But importantly, because hylomorphism is a further fact theory, I think that options 1 and 2 are now suddenly on the table. Why? Because A could be B or A could be C and not the other, because one of them could have the rational soul and the other one could lack it. This is very similar to the maneuver that Richard Swinburne made when he talked about the psychological fission cases. What substance dualism can do that psychological approaches cannot is that it can say that there is a further fact in the world that makes you one of the offshoots rather than the other, namely where your soul is. And I think hylomorphists could do the similar thing with this kind of fission, which is monozygotic twinning. They can say that your rational soul is in one of the offshoots rather than the other, and so therefore B or C is the same organism as A. So I actually think hylomorphism has 3 options. They could say 1, A is B, 2, A is C, or 4, A is no more, and B and C are both brand new organisms. Could the hylomorphists say 5, that both B and C were there all along? I'm not sure that the hylomorphists can say this, because what they'd have to say is that in order for there to be 2 persons there, there'd have to be 2 souls there. And for there to be 2 souls there, there'd have to be 2 organisms, 2 bodies. But what we're saying is that A is a zygote. It's one single body, one single organism, if it is an organism at all. And so it doesn't look like it's available to hylomorphists to pursue option 5. In order to pursue option 5, you'd have to be able to say that 2 souls can be in the same body. But according to hylomorphism, that's straightforwardly disallowed. That would violate Aquinas' unicity doctrine. Could the substance dualist, if they had some reason to think that souls were here that early on, could they pursue option 5? I think they could. And that might be a possible advantage for the substance dualist, is that they have an additional option even beyond what standard animalism and hylomorphism can offer, because they could say that there are two souls there in A, even though there's just one body, because they have no restriction on how many souls can be within the same body. Now, here's what I want to say about this. Often monozygotic twinning is pushed as an argument for thinking that the human organism cannot possibly be there before twinning could still take place. Why? Because none of the options are good. But what I want to suggest is, well, wait a second. Option 4 for the animalist is still a logically consistent option. And the hylomorphic animalist still has logically consistent options of 1, 2, or 4. What I want to say is that this argument doesn't seem to actually push us into an option that says that there's no possible way the human organism could be there, right? Think about the fission cases that we talked about with the psychological approach. Even though all the options seemed uncomfortable for the psychological theorist, notice that the puzzle about fission there didn't lead anybody to think that, oh, well, there must not have been there a person before we put the two parts of the brain. No. No one concluded that. It was abundantly clear to everyone that, no, there was a person there beforehand. That's what gives rise to the puzzle. And because of the puzzle, no one backtracks and says, oh, okay, well, there was no person there to begin with. No one takes that route. And so I think similarly in the case of monozygotic twinning, it's not clear to me that anyone has to backtrack and say that there wasn't ever any organism there in the first place. Otherwise, right, the psychological approach theorist would have to say that, oh, in the double brain transplant case, because of the complications of the fission, right, it means that there was no person there beforehand. No, nobody reaches that conclusion. And similarly, I don't think anyone should reach that conclusion just because fission is a tough case, that there wasn't a human organism there beforehand. Once again, consider the analogy. If you were licensed to conclude that, then you'd be licensed to conclude that there were no human person there prior to the double transplant. But that doesn't seem like you're licensed to conclude that at all. That doesn't seem like a very promising option. So I don't think the problem of monozygotic twinning actually pushes us into thinking that there's no human organism there. I think there are options for there being the organism that, right? There being an organism there before monozygotic twinning is no longer possible. It could be that the original human organism that was there had to die in order to give rise to the two twins. It could be that the original human organism is one of the offshoots rather than the other. Only a hylomorphist or substance dualist can say this, though. And so I think that there are options, logically consistent options, for preserving the claim that there was a human organism there right from the moment of conception. And so I don't think that people keep pushing this argument that monozygotic twinning pushes us into say that there couldn't possibly be a human organism there prior to the inability for it to fission. I want to say this is a bad argument for that conclusion. It does force us into saying something funny, right? So once again, let me emphasize. What monozygotic twinning forces us to do is to say something very funny about what happens at the very early stages of life in cases of twinning. It forces us to either say that in every case of monozygotic twinning, that the original human organism that began to exist from conception, which is one of us, the kind of thing that we are, had to die so as to produce these two twins. So if you know any identical twins, right, there's a sense in which, right, they come from their parents indirectly through being offshoots of the human organism that their parents directly conceived. Their parents directly conceived one human organism, and that human organism perished, and they, right, are the result of the perishing or the fissioning of that original human organism that their parents conceived. Does that mean they're not, strictly speaking, reproduced by their parents? I'm not so sure. My wife is really worried about this. I've talked to her a lot about this. And she's worried that, well, if you say that the original human organism perished, then doesn't that mean that the two offshoots actually are like the sons or daughters of that original human organism, not the parents? I'm not sure that that exactly follows, because it's still very much the genetic material of the parents, and it's still sort of housed within the womb. But it might be a kind of, right, human asexual reproduction. In a way, maybe it turns out what monozygotic twinning shows us is that some human persons are a result of not sort of standard sexual reproduction, but are only indirectly a result of that they are directly a result of a kind of splitting, a kind of asexual human reproduction. Well, what if we pursue one of the options where A doesn't die, A is just one of the offshoots rather than the other? That has the curious result that, as I said, one of the twins is at least a couple days older than the other, and the other one is, in a way, something that budded off of the original. Now, does that mean that the one who's a little bit younger sort of is not a direct result of the sexual reproduction of the parents, but is only indirectly, is a sort of result of the original human organism that they conceived? Is a sense in which the answer is yes. And so, whereas I don't think monozygotic twinning forces us to the conclusion that there couldn't have been a human person there prior to twinning no longer being possible, I think it does force us into saying something funny about what happens at the beginning of human life. Either every case of monozygotic twinning causes the death of a human organism, or one of the twins is older than the other. And in any case, it's a weird sort of almost asexual reproduction that happens in both cases. It means that some of us don't begin to exist at conception. And it means that some of us aren't a direct result of sexual reproduction, but maybe even sort of an indirect result. Those are curious results, but I don't think either one of them, any of the results, push us into thinking that there couldn't possibly have been a human person there. Okay, so if monozygotic twinning isn't a very good argument for thinking that there couldn't possibly have been a human organism there from conception, it might just force us into say something funny about what goes on at that stage. Are there any good reasons to think that the human organism does begin to exist at conception? And I have a few listed here. And as I said, a lot of this requires a whole lot of careful empirical study about what's going on at the very early stages of life, about whether we do have, right, not just life processes, but that a singular life, coordinated life processes, not just parts, but parts that are composing a whole thing and which are sort of internally constructing themselves or internally organizing or internally coordinating themselves. So when can we say that some smaller things compose an organism, or when can we say that the activities of some smaller things compose a life? Well, here are some interesting features, I think some important features to keep in mind about what we have at conception. At conception, what we have there, the result is something that is genetically complete. In other words, it has the full genetic code of a human organism. It's also genetically distinct from both the mother and the father. It's not a part of the father, it's not a part of the mother. Why? Because it has a different set of DNA. It has a different genetic code than it has pieces of both, but only halves of each. It has its own unique sort of blueprint or design. So I think that makes it pretty clear that it can't be a part of the mother, and it's not still part of the father. Another feature that we can identify in the early zygote and early embryo is that it has its own kind of internal directionality. There are concerns about how big of a role the mother's body is playing in orchestrating the development. But here's one feature I think that I always bring this point up because I think it's a good one. When conception occurs, right? The mother's initial reaction, right, its natural reaction, is that there's an intruder, that it should be expelled. What the early embryo has to do is that it has to send chemical signals to the mother's body to say, no, I'm supposed to be here, don't attack us, right? It's good. And so the mother's body has to be reminded or has to be told that this is not a bad intruder from the outside, but that it's supposed to be here. And I think that's an indication, right, that this is not simply a part of the mother and that it has, right, sort of its own processes, its own internal sort of coordination. I think also what we can identify here is a sort of internal directionality in the zygote and early embryo. With the proper environment and absent any injury or defect, it will develop into something that possesses psychological capacities according to its own internal plan. It has its own DNA, it has its own sort of forward thrust. It just needs a proper environment from the mother's body, and indeed as technology develops, maybe not even the mother's body, it just needs a proper environment in order to be able to orchestrate its own design plan. And I also think that there are all sorts of empirical concerns that I think can count in favor of the organism being there from conception onward. It would require looking at what point we have specialization of jobs for the different cells within the zygote or the early embryo, about how much coordination there is between these life processes. I'm not suitably trained to be able to adjudicate on that. But that's the sort of thing you'd have to look into in order to establish that the human organism is present from conception onward. So what I wanted to try to illustrate then in this lecture is to explore the question of when we begin to exist on various theories of the human person. If you want to argue, for example, that we begin to exist at conception, you've got at least two big tasks in front of you. One, you've got to argue that the psychological approaches, which will say that you begin to exist much later, are the wrong account of the human person. You have to go back and do all the metaphysical work to show that the psychological approaches are false, and that something like animalism or hydromorphic animalism is the right view. That would get you to very early on in the pregnancy. But once you've established that the psychological approaches are wrong and something like animalism or the hydromorphic animalism is the right view, you've still got more work to do if you want to argue that we began to exist at conception. Now you've got to consider these other puzzles about what happened in the developmental stages earlier on. You have to bring in you have to give a clear account of what we should say about monozygotic twinning. You have to give some good empirical facts that establish that what we have is a distinct living thing, something that is internally coordinated, internally unified, that is different from the mother and the father, which has its own design plan and has a forward thrust, has a certain developmental trajectory. If you can do all that, then you might be able to establish that we begin to exist at conception. But it's a lot of work. And if you want to argue for the moral impermissibility of something like abortion or embryonic stem cell research, and you want to provide an argument that relies on a claim that whatever is involved is the same sort of thing that we once were, that's the sort of work you would need to do in order to make that argument persuasive. And so these various issues at the beginning of life, these ethical issues about abortion, embryonic stem cell research, maybe some forms of contraception, IVF, embryo adoption, a lot of them depend, right, on determining whether these things are morally right or morally wrong. A lot of those depend on doing a lot of careful work about establishing what sort of thing we are and when the sort of thing that we are began to exist. And this is one area I think it's so crucial then to get it right about what is the best metaphysical account of what we are and what is wrong with all the other views that lend support to this particular view. In no short way, right, in no small way is this a matter of life and death, getting it right, what sort of thing we are and when that thing that we are began to exist. And I hope to sort of illustrate that through this debate, the relationship between the metaphysics of the human person and issues at the beginning of life. Next time, we'll turn to the other side of things. We'll look at the relationship, the application of theories of the human person to the issue about when it is that the human person ceases to exist, or when the human person can be said to die.